Okay, hi everyone once again, and welcome to our today's session. So today we are going to have a lecture by Kashima, who was a researcher in the GRAM-ADAPT project, and she's going to talk to us about comparing contexts by a sociolinguistic typological approach. So some take-home messages from GRAM-ADAPT project from this perspective. And Eri is currently affiliated with the Australian National University in Canberra, and she is in fact there. This is why this lecture is actually recorded. So we'll listen to Eri's contribution, and we will have some discussion in the middle of the session. So it's great that you are here. Okay, so I'm giving the virtual floor to Eri here.
Hello, so my name is Kashima. It's wonderful to be able to speak to you about the research I've been conducting as part of Gaius Cinemaki's GRAM-ADAPT project. I'm funded by the ERC. I believe that Gaius has presented the broad overview and the structure of the research design in the previous lecture. So today I'll be digging into the sociolinguistic component. So by way of introduction, I do think actually my background does inform quite a lot of the research design and some of the decisions that we took when we decided to go collecting the sociolinguistic data for studying the social elements of language contact. So I conducted fieldwork in the remote part of Papua New Guinea for my PhD studies. This was a rural part of the country, a highly multilingual area where people will be quite fluent in speaking many of the local languages. So the local languages may have anywhere between 200 to 1,000 local speakers, and then these people will quite often speak the language of their relatives or their neighbours to quite a high degree of fluency also. So coming from this kind of background, I must confess that a lot of the mainstream literature on bilingualism and language contact, the terminology was something that I found quite difficult to understand. So I was quite interested in tackling the more general human foundations of contact and bilingualism rather than linguistic ones. And I hope that will become a bit clearer as we go through this lecture. So the structure of the talk is as follows. We'll begin by considering why we might want to study language contact from a global perspective and why we might want to study the social aspect in particular. We'll extrapolate on what we mean by context and whether these different contexts can indeed be compared. I'll argue in the affirmative, and we'll go through the design principles of the sociolinguistic questionnaire which embody the basis on which we try and do the comparisons of the context. We'll talk about the sampling just very briefly. These are things that Gaius would have spoken about in his lecture, but we'll spend most of our time looking carefully at the explanatory factors, which I consider the fundamental part of why it is that comparison can arguably be done across contact contexts. And we'll introduce the idea of the social domains and mention a couple of additional considerations about the questionnaire as a tool for data collection. We'll look at quantification as a demonstration that this tool is feasible. It is actually usable to collect comparative data up to a point, and so we'll consider the limitations of this tool in the discussion and reflection, and also consider how the tool can be improved and what other kinds of tools of comparison may be developed in the future. So why indeed study language contact from a global perspective? So language contact is an outcome of linguistic structural change. So for example, why does Finnish have SVO word order in a transitive clause, but Sami, a related language, have SOV word order? Studying language contact is studying how a human symbolic informational system changes synchronically and diachronically when speakers and signers consciously or unconsciously incorporate aspects of another symbolic informational system. This is not a typical definition of language contact. It's the working definition that I would like to improve over time to come up with a more generalized definition of what we mean by language contact. I think if you look at other disciplines which talk about systems thinking or talk about systems, they're not, I think there's a general element to them. I fear that when linguists talk about language change in particular, and as I mentioned before, talking about language contact or bilingualism, it becomes a very linguistic definition, and the human cognitive dimension of it, I feel it's quite hard to see in when we have the linguistic structural aspects of the focus. Nonetheless, a more common definition of language contact, for example, Sarah Thomason's definition, it's a linguistic change that would have been less likely to occur outside a particular contact situation, due at least in part to language contact. Heine and Kuteva have something similar when they say, we'll say that contact-induced linguistic change has taken place when a group of speakers regularly show linguistic behaviors that differ from that of earlier generation of speakers, and where this behavior can be demonstrated to have been influenced in some way by language contact. So in other words, there's this idea that the language will tend to change in language internal ways that are more likely to occur because of its genealogy, because of the language family that it belongs to, but a change which is a lot more unexpected or quite obviously influenced from another language system can be found in a language, and that's because language contact has happened where a different kind of system has influenced the Finnish language, which would have gone along its merry Finno-Ugric way had it not been from the influence of Indo-European languages, for example. That's the kind of idea. So it might sound like a very academic kind of question, a bit self-indulgent even, but there are some real-world consequences and challenges to language contact. So for example, we could ask this question, what kind of contact scenarios lead to language attrition and death? So we often think of contexts like the hegemony of English as a prestige language of economic opportunity. And while this is often true in many contexts, language attrition and shift happen in contexts other than these. For example, the shift from Sami languages to national varieties across the Nordic countries and Russia, so that's not English, and also perhaps to shift towards Northern Sami. So perhaps there are other concerns other than pure economic opportunity from the speaker's point of view. Where I did my fieldwork in remote New Guinea, you had shifts from one vernacular language, Nambo, to Nambo, another variety. So these are very close varieties, but you still find language loss between vernaculars with quite small numbers of people in quite non-hierarchical societies too. So if we do want to understand perhaps the deeper driving factors of why we have certain kinds of language change because of language contact, including attrition and shift, then we do need to study a variety of contexts and think quite critically about what might be driving the phenomena towards certain kinds of outcomes. So I've used the word context quite a lot already, and I suppose that's a little bit vague. But by context, we mean things like, we mean extralinguistic factors. So when one comes across the language contact literature, it's pretty clear that things other than the structure of the language, so that's the morphosyntax, lexicon, phonology, things apart from this do play a role in the trajectories and outcomes of language contact. But this is a very general question, and we don't actually know if there are any specific beyond this general statement. So extralinguistic factors, what do we mean by this? So the environment in which the speakers and signers are using their language. I'm not a huge fan of this word to use a language, but I suppose it's illustrative and it's the clearest that I could come up with at this point in time. The term a language ecology of speakers and signers, that's another way of thinking about it. Or non-linguistic macro socio-cultural demographic aspects. Some linguists would call this the sociolinguistic aspects of language contact. More specifically, factors like the population size of a speech community, the proportion of L1 and L2 speakers or signers in a community. So that's L1 for first language learners, L2 for second language learners. So this idea that if you have quite a high proportion of speakers who learn a language as their first language, then they're not going to form morphosyntactic or linguistic errors, as opposed to if you had a population where a lot of people are second language learners, then perhaps some second language learner errors, I'm using air quotes here, may make their way into a linguistic system and become entrenched over time. Another thing that gets considered a contextual factor might be the speaker's attitudes and ideologies about language or about other groups in their communities, and other kinds of behavior affecting biases which are traditionally not considered part of the linguistic system. So these kinds of things that can influence speakers and signers are what we mean by context. And there's a quote by Sarah Thomason, which I thought was, it's quite a strong statement, but I think it's kind of a good point, actually, that there's good reason to view social factors as primary and linguistic factors as secondary in predicting contact-induced change, and that this is still true, that no one has successfully proposed absolute linguistic constraints on contact-induced change. So can different non-linguistic factors or contexts or language ecologies, can these actually be compared across time and space? Traditional humanities tends to be skeptical of this endeavour, such as the people with the theoretical orientation of historical particularism. And this is a perspective popularised by Franz Boas, anthropologist, but of course is also a linguist. And Boas developed this kind of thinking, and others contributed to it too, many of his students, including Ruth Benedict and Edward Sapir. And it describes a historical perspective on why societies are the way they are, as opposed to the social evolutionism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Social evolutionism posited, from this time period, it posited that humans share, quote, a set of characteristics and modes of thinking that transcend individual cultures. That sounds okay. And therefore, the cultural development of individual societies will reflect this transcendent commonality through a similar series of developmental stages. So the implication, it's perhaps the second part of it that is the more problematic. The second part, the implication is that there is societal progress in these stages, so that there are these universal characteristics and modes of thinking that are common in all cultures. So it means if it's universal, then all societies are going to have to go through these different stages. Ergo, there's a straight linear progression from the earliest stages of human society through to maybe a final form. So Boas and colleagues' rejection of social evolutionism was actually also a rejection of scientific racism. The emphasis that Boas and his colleagues wanted to make was that, no, we actually need to collect strong data via ethnographic fieldwork before we can determine whether there's any kind of linear progress to societies. So actually, in my reading, Boas's or historical particularism's rejection of social evolutionism was more so and I think it's just actually bad analysis, saying that, okay, so if you've got these universal modes of thinking that transcend individual cultures, that therefore there's a linear progression, that's not necessarily true, right? You can have universal characteristics that are quite common, or universal characteristics of human beings and societies, but they may not all manifest at the same time, that they might combine in different ways to create different forms of culture or behavior. So I actually don't think that there's necessarily a problem with positing with evidence and positing that human beings have at least constraints on the kinds of behaviors and modes of thinking and cultural outputs that we have. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to have to be a linear progression from, air quotes, primitive through to develop, So what Boas and other historical particularists would say, no, before we can say any of this, we actually need to do the ethnographic work to see whether this hypothesis of linear progression bears out. And you would have seen from the Gingrich reading, I hope, that while social anthropology in particular rejected this grand narrative of humankind story, in part because in part of the thinking, like the works of Boas and other particularists. But to quote Gingrich, yet it soon became obvious that as an academic field, anthropology could not sufficiently address any larger issues, nor sustain any credibility and legitimacy if based on nothing else but particularities. At the same time, the growing impact of various dimensions of globalization also redirected researchers' attention increasingly towards inquiries about what humans share and where they differ in their interactions with that impact. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, I don't think Boas actually kept quite an open mind. To quote Smith, Scruggs, Berry and Lewis, the Boasians believed that so many different stimuli acted on the development of a culture that its historical trajectory could only be understood by first examining the particulars of a specific culture so that the sources of stimuli could be identified. Only then may theories of cultural development be constructed after being firmly based on a multitude of synchronic studies pieced together to form a pattern of development. So like I was saying before, I think it was the strong stance of historical particularism, rejecting any ideas of universalism in human behavior and cultures, comes from the poor scientific implicature of linear progression. and it's a reflection, it's a theoretical orientation that reflects the academic climate of the time. So this is all to say, I do think that different contexts can be compared to an extent. The studies of language contact, and especially the social dimensions of language contact, have tended towards case studies. And these case studies are like the ethnographic work that Boas says is crucial for anthropology. The case studies of language contact and the social dimensions of language contact offer in-depth views as to what kind of factors are operating in that particular moment, in that particular place. And it provides a nuance of the particulars which are really necessary, I think, to get to the underlying factors, or the combination of the multiple factors that lead towards a particular outcome. So case studies of particular contact situations are perhaps akin to individual language grammars. So they're the descriptive basis of a particular language on their own merits. To use Haspelmath's analogy of language-specific versus comparative concepts in linguistic typology. So if linguistic typology's goal is to show which structures are possible in general and why it is just those structures and not others that are possible, we can say sociolinguistic typology's goal is likewise to answer what is where and why, under what circumstances. So in order to do a comparison of any kind, we want to invoke the notions of the principles of comparison. You want to have the comparator, that's the units of comparison, and fancy Latin term, the tertium comparationis, that point of contact that allows the comparison to proceed. So for any of the unit that you're comparing, there has to be at least one point of contact that you're able to link those two comparator together by. And we'll spend a fair bit of time looking at this in the next couple of seconds. That's coming up. So sociolinguistic typology is something of a nascent field. It's still emerging and developing. If you do a quick search of the term, say comparative sociolinguistic, for example, it has been used in other ways. Gaius has written a paper about that, which will hopefully be published soon. But for example, corpus sociolinguists investigating parallel corpora, such as the work by Sally Tagliamonte. She describes her work as comparative sociolinguistic, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about sociolinguistic typology, which is analogous to the Greenbergian linguistic typology, comparing language structures at a very large scale. Peter Trudgill's sociolinguistic typology, published in 2011, was quite influential. We're 14 years on now, and his ideas are still being explored in lots of different kinds of work. Some other studies which I consider like sociolinguistic typological, we have the database of hunter-gatherers, which Blair Bowen's written a paper about to introduce it. The Atlas of Pidgin and Griot structures has a section on sociolinguistic aspects of the Pidgins and Griots that they investigate. And finally, we've got the database dplace. This collects a vast amount of data on various human societies. It collects the data from the human relations area files and the Binford hunter-gatherer dataset, and is quite an extraordinary resource. So if you're familiar with linguistic typology and databases like the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures, WALS, these databases that I mentioned, these three, would seem probably quite familiar. So I've been talking for a while, so now I'd invite you to have a stretch, have 5 minutes to have a look at these databases. And because, just me talking about it, it's probably a bit difficult to envisage. So when you're looking at these databases, I'd just like you to take note. What do you notice about these databases? What kind of sociolinguistic factors are covered? What are the units of comparison? dplace is not about languages specifically, so this dplace is maybe the odd one out here, but nonetheless I'd like you to have a look at it to see what kind of factors are covered here. So have 5 minutes, stand up, grab a cup of tea or a glass of water, and have a look at these. And after 5 minutes, perhaps, if Senya's okay with this, just have a little bit of a discussion here, just for a couple of minutes, before we continue on with the rest of the lecture.
Okay, so here we have some time to actually have a look at those databases. So this is what I would ask you to do right now individually. So the links are over here. So you can you can Google those databases. I think that I try to do that myself. I think that 5 minutes is actually too little time. So let's say we take 10 minutes because we have enough time to take a closer look at these databases, and then we will have a chat about that. So I will start the timer actually in 5 minutes, and then when Eri tells us to come back, then we will. So now we have 10 minutes for that, and we meet at 6:37 to have a chat about the databases.
Welcome back. So I hope you, or as a group, you came up with a couple of observations of those databases. So bear those in mind as we go through the design principles of the global comparative sociolinguistics that we did for the GramAdapt project. So in order to get at I'll just call them sociolinguistic, the sociolinguistic factors that have been hypothesized or that have been suggested as relevant in the linguistics literature. In order to collect data on the number of these things, we designed a questionnaire to elicit this data from for various communities in different parts of the world. So this, what we call the questionnaire, was a tool for collecting data on explanatory factors of language contact and change. And this questionnaire was aimed at field workers who have experience with either one or both contact pair communities. And the questions were asked in such a way that field workers can provide their subjective assessment. And you'll see what I mean by this as we go along. So the broader methodology is we've got the sampling to consider, which Kaius would have talked about as well. There's just some considerations specific to the questionnaire. There are the explanatory factors of language change, the sociolinguistic variables. The questionnaire has two parts to it, the overview questionnaire and the social domains questionnaire. We're not going to talk about the overview questionnaire much. We'll focus on the social domains questionnaire. But if you'd like to know more about this methodology and the questionnaire structure, we've just had a paper accepted by the journal Language Dynamics and Change. So hopefully this paper will come out in short order if you'd like to spend a bit more time because we're going to run through it in this talk. So if you want to spend a bit more time becoming acquainted with the ideas, this paper would be the place to do it. So the sampling, guys talked about that, the use of the autotyp areas and whatnot. But for the sociolinguistic data, unlike the linguistic sampling, which has a triad of languages, we have just pairs of languages. So that is, we've got what's called the focus group and the neighbor group language, and this pair of language forms the sampling unit. So unlike those other databases which you had a look at, where the sampling unit is one society or one language, we have the pairs. So the focus group is the community where we focus on to assess the linguistic outcomes of contact. But we also, in the questionnaire, we asked the respondent to consider what is happening in the focus group. What do the focus group people do when they're interacting with neighbor group people? So we have a list of the languages that was sampled for the sociolinguistic questionnaire. There's a bit of a discrepancy with the linguistic data and the sociolinguistic data. Most of it's the same, but there is a small discrepancy. So you can see the language pairs there in the table. Most respondents are linguists, 44 out of the 47, and most respondents are researchers from outside the community in question. I think maybe 3 of our respondents would consider themselves members of either the focus or the neighbor group. So that's just the one point to make about sampling for social contact. Now on to our tertium comparationis, the explanatory factors of language change. So the reason that I think that comparing social contexts has been more difficult in the past is because we weren't sure what elements are similar across peoples and groups. But I do think actually in academic research we have a better idea of what these things might be. So these bases of comparisons, we call them explanatory factors, in this project. We take the approach that language use is embedded in social interaction between individuals and groups. And so there's a lot of emphasis on the nature of interaction, what happens in individual people's minds, and the dynamics that occur within and across groups. So we've got 4 levels of explanatory factors, you can see in that color-coded table there. We'll go from the smallest level of consideration, the blue cognitive processing there, and we'll work through to the larger language ecological factors. So the first level, we call it the cognitive processing type of explanatory factors. So just to clarify, these are factors that have been proposed in academic research as being consequential for language change and language change broadly, including language contact outcomes. So at this first level, the cognitive processing refers to domain general processes. So what our brains do, basically. So things like the effects of long and short-term memory, the fact that we're statistical learners, that we use Bayesian inferencing in our day-to-day lives. We have the ability to predict what comes next based on our previous experience. So these kinds of superpowers that we have. So I mentioned earlier this commonly proposed factor that if you have a large number of second language learners of a language in a population, that maybe the second language learner type errors that they make might spread into a speech community and might be transmitted over time and may become entrenched in a linguistic system. And this is that kind of idea. So implicit behind this idea is that one's first language or one's dominant language has a real impact on the subsequent learning of linguistic structures later in life. So it's once you've passed that critical period that this is the kind of idea. So I mentioned here, while talking about L1 and L2 might be useful in some contexts, like more or less or largely monolingual populations like in Australia or Japan. These terms are quite useful, but then in other parts of the world, Indonesia, Cameroon, India, Southern New Guinea, these like L1 and L2 is not a particularly powerful term. So what's more important perhaps is considering prior learning of a person. So we don't use terms like L1 and L2 when asking questions in the questionnaire. But so we tried to drill behind what's the actual explanatory factor behind this idea of L1 and L2. So those are the cognitive processing type explanatory factors. Then we have the interactional or social cognitive type of explanatory factors. So these are also domain general processes, which are apparently active when interaction occurs, which are active. So our ability to take the perspective of our interlocutor when we're speaking, things like theory of mind, so our ability to know what our interlocutor does or does not know about the world. The fact that people will often accommodate to their interlocutors in terms of linguistic skill or speech style, or people may reject accommodation. So mirroring the patterns of their interlocutor. We sometimes choose to, let me start again. When we're speaking with people we're familiar with, we know that that person shares a lot of the social context with us. We speak with a lot of deixis and anaphora with familiar people. But when we're speaking to strangers, where we think, this person might not know the context very well, we might do a lot more context setting, foregrounding of information, these kind of patterns of interaction based on our assessment of our interlocutor. And of course, this ability or these social cognitive abilities of ours are something that we learn and reinforce through interacting with other people, and it's something that we acquire as children. Language acquisition is arguably language socialization. So those kinds of abilities of ours are thought to be consequential too. Now, another level up, there are those explanatory factors pertaining to groups, or more specifically, social networks. So these explanatory factors consider how information flows between individuals and groups. So if there's a linguistic innovation, so some person comes up with an innovation, how does that spread across a group and why does it? Does the way people connect to one another have an impact? And this has been suggested. Studies based on agent-based modeling, but also fieldwork have suggested that the structure of social networks, the way that people are connected, does have consequences. So the Peter Trudgill's sociolinguistic typology I mentioned earlier came up with this idea that what he calls the society of intimates will have these social networks where everybody knows each other. People work together, they form families with one another, they trade with one another, they do a lot of things to one another. So this is what he calls a dense multiplex social network, and that in these types of communities, language change outcomes tend to lead to complexification. On the other hand, if you have social networks where people aren't that densely connected, so you might have a colleague, but they're just your colleague. There's your cousin who's just your cousin. You don't work with them. You don't study with them. That's just the only relationship you have. You know a lot of people, but you're not particularly close with anyone. These kinds of loose, diffuse social networks might lead to simplification in structures. And while Trudgill's talking about complexification and simplification, still this idea that the network structure type has consequences for language change outcomes has been really influential and has sparked people's imagination a lot, that people have investigated to see whether they can find evidence for this in other empirical methods. And finally, they've got the explanatory factors of the macro context of language use. So this is at the kind of highest level, the stuff that's really difficult to quantify actually, but people have mentioned time and time again affect people's behaviors, and they absolutely do. So these are the things like people's attitudes and ideologies, not just about language, but about other groups. Maybe things like the socioeconomic variables come into this area as well. A common thread in many of these macro contexts of language use type explanatory factors has been the focus of power, and how ideologies, beliefs, and attitudes in particular manifest expressions of how power is understood in a community, and that these types of things affect individual people's behaviors. So we might want to know something about beliefs and attitudes. So we do ask about these things in the questionnaire. That's all that I wanted to say here. So that was a crash course in the type of explanatory factors that we've been able to identify in the literature. So putting it into these 4 categories was an exercise unto itself. It's still kind of ongoing, but we've identified these 4 broad types of factors. So this is what's been suggested as being consequential for language change and language contact outcomes. So let's try and elicit some data on these factors. So on the right here, we've got the questionnaire sections. You don't need to look at this in particular detail, just to say that, for example, we ask about the cognitive processing type explanatory factors in the section concerning linguistic output and linguistic input of the focus group. The question about network structures is asked in the social network part of the questionnaire, and so forth. So in order to get to a variety of explanatory factors, we structure the questionnaire, structure questions in a way that field workers can hopefully answer, and answer they did. And so this was the approach that we took. Rather than getting people to analyze prior whether, is the social network of this community dense and multiplex? Well, you might not know that, but people can tell us, does everybody know each other in a speech community? Yeah, people do tend to, or nah, people are quite, they don't really know their neighbours very much. This kind of assessment people can do. So rather than a priori asking people to provide an analysis, we try and paint a picture based on the observations of field workers. Of course, there's subjective assessments, subjective observations, but nonetheless, we can talk about this a bit later, or mention this in discussion. Okay, so here are just some examples of the types of how these explanatory factors are expressed as questions. So an example of the cognitive processing question, we ask, what language do focus group people typically speak with a neighbour group person when they're trading, for example. So this will give us an idea of what output focus group people are producing, which might then help us paint a picture either of language dominance, maybe of first languageness. At least we can get some idea of the frequency at which the focus language is spoken in a particular context scenario. Let's consider the language ecology one. So how do focus group people view themselves overall in relation to neighbour group people within the context of, let's say, knowledge, within a school context? Do they view themselves very positively, or do they view themselves negatively? Do they see themselves as inferior, or is it neither of these things? So I mentioned trade and knowledge just then. So that's another component of how we structure the questionnaire. So I mentioned we have something called the overview questionnaire and the domains questionnaire, and this is what we mean by the domains, so different areas of activity. You may have come across this notion of social domains. It was popularized by Joshua Fishman back in 1965. The earliest iteration of social domains in linguistics predates Fishman. But this was a framework to think systematically about where languages are spoken or signed. It was a way to investigate systematically different linguistic behaviors across varying social contexts. So a domain is a probabilistic circumscribing of context. So that's saying, okay, let's consider an activity, for example, trading. What kind of role relationships do we find when we're trading? So we'll have, the person who's selling something and the person who's buying something, for example. What kinds of topics of communication come up in trade? And then what kind of linguistic behaviors might come out of those topics. So it's a way of organizing the myriad of activities that human beings engage in. So we chose social domains as a way to practically divide the questionnaire rather than just having a massive set of questions about saying, thinking generally, because that's quite hard. So rather we say, okay, let's think about trade. Is there social contact in trade? Okay, between the focus and neighbour group? Great. Now let's consider some behaviours and norms, some observations that you have about behaviours and activities in this social domain. So it was a way to make the questionnaire a bit more manageable. And indeed, social domains was developed as a kind of comparative concept in the first instance. So we adopted that approach here. There are some critiques that one could level against the notion of social domains, but if you want to read about that, have a look at the paper, our paper that I mentioned earlier. So here are 6 social domains that we have for this questionnaire. We have the local community, trade, family and kin, labour, social exchange and knowledge. So most of these would probably you'll have an idea of what these social domains represent, and we left it general enough so that respondents could try and identify these domains in the contact areas that they worked in. And more or less, it was successful. Just to clarify, we have these 6 social domains, and we ask respondents, okay, in which domains do you have social contact? And for each social domain that there is contact, we ask them to respond to the set of questions targeting the explanatory factors. So in this way, we kind of get a lattice, if you think of it like a lattice, explanatory factor by social domain, and we systematically try and find the data, fill out the data for the variables and domains that we're interested in to try and paint a picture of what social contact looks like in these scenarios that we're sampling for. So we've considered the structure of the sociolinguistic questionnaire, we've considered the sampling units, the basis of comparison, and how the data may be elicited. And we put this questionnaire out to linguist colleagues, anthropologist colleagues in some cases, and we managed to get responses for 34 language pairs, which resulted in 12,554 data points, and this is what we call the GrammarDAP social contact dataset, which is now available in Zenodo. It's open access. So in this quantification section, I want to demonstrate the results of this questionnaire, the kinds of things that are possible to investigate and what kind of things are not possible. So we'll first spend just a bit of time looking at the data type or the data structure that results from using the questionnaire, and then some results based on very simple counting, but still very informative, and then some potential of looking at slightly more complex forms of quantification. For example, if we wanted to numericize contact intensity, that we might be able to do it in multiple ways through the responses to this questionnaire. So data types. We describe the questionnaire as being qualitative with quantitative potential. And what we mean by this is that the responses to the questionnaire are actually predetermined. Some questions you can elaborate in a comment form, but in order to make the data comparable and manageable, we require respondents to choose an answer which is predetermined. So some answers are binary yes or no's. For example, is there social contact in this domain? Yes or no. Many of our questions are scalar responses, so a 5-point scale, a Likert scale. The answers that the respondents see is in a textual form, but then these can be put onto a scale of 1 to 5. So, for example, what's the focus group's attitude towards the neighbor group? It's very negative, neither negative nor positive, very positive. So these answers can be put on a 5-point scale. One other type that we had is that we limited the respondents to choose focus language, neighbor language, some other language, or this is highly contextual. And these were relating to the questions of language use or languages that people were exposed to. But all of the questions had a comment section so that respondents could elaborate a little bit more to indicate maybe uncertainty regarding the question, or they'd like to elaborate a bit more on why they chose a certain answer, or they might say, I chose this answer, but, I have an issue with this question for this reason. So we left that comment section so that the respondents could also feel that they weren't too hemmed in by the requirements of the questionnaire, but also so we as analysts can try and understand a bit more perhaps why a certain answer was chosen. So with that kind of data type, when you put things into numbers, what do we see? We find that about 20% of our responses are NAs, so not applicables. And so what this means is, so this doesn't mean that people skipped answers. What this actually means, that's showing us where social contact didn't happen, because at the very beginning we asked, does contact happen in this domain? And if the answer is no, then that part of the questionnaire is populated with NAs. So it's interesting, I guess about 1/5 of the data responses were NA. So overall, 4/5 of the responses, we had some kind of responses, meaning that there's a lot of social contact across our sample. So when we look at things, when we look at the response sets and say divide them by domain, all domains have a higher yes response than a no response. What do I mean by that? So at the very top, we have where we ask questions about 6 social domains. 13 of the 33 sets say yes to all 6 domains. 6 out of 33 have social contact in 3 domains and no contact in 3 domains. We only have 1 set which has only 1 social domain where contact occurs. I've said this before, and perhaps it sounds trivial, but I still think it's quite interesting, is that if you have 2 language isoglosses in a geographically contiguous area, it's really likely that there's social contact going on. You can assume that there is interaction happening at least where those isoglosses meet, at least where there is that area, which is not a sharp boundary, but is diffuse, where people are moving around in a particular area. And this is a table that Gaius would have shown in his talk as well, but in one of the things that we write up in a paper, we being Francesca Di Garbo, Gaius and myself, is that you can come up with an implicational hierarchy of sorts. To quote the paper directly, if there is contact in the social domain of social exchange, that's the purple one in the top left, there is likely contact in the other domains up in the hierarchy as well. However, if there is contact in the social domain of trade, as in the bottom right in the yellow, that does not yet tell whether there is contact in any other domain down the hierarchy. Language contact in the social domains of knowledge and social exchange is the least typical and seems to first require contact in at least some other social domain higher up in the hierarchy. In other words, if you have social contact in social exchange or in the knowledge domain, there's a good chance that you're going to be having social contact in the domains of trade as well, and in the low community and in labour. But if you just find a pair where contact only occurs in trade, hard to say. Perhaps there is no social contact in any other domain. So even with counting, I think you can get some quite powerful insights into the social domains of contact. We've just looked at were counting simple yes or no answers to whether there is contact happening in a certain social domain or not. But what about the other explanatory factors that we got data for? And what about combining multiple factors to try and get at a measure for various conglomerate or multi-causal factors which have been suggested as directing the course of language change. So there's ways to do this, and so we'll just do a demonstration of one multi-causal factor which we call the presence of the neighbour community. So the idea is that the more there is the presence of the neighbour community, the more there is the linguistic presence of the neighbour community in a focus community, the more likely it is that you'll find deeper entrenched effects. So the greater the contact, the greater the linguistic consequences of language contact. This is a simplified idea of this notion of contact intensity. So which of the questions from our questionnaire could represent a measure of contact intensity? So I've identified 6 variables here, 6 questions ranging from how do focus group people interact with neighbour group people, right through to how much do focus children participate in any given domain. So the greater the score for these 6 particular questions, arguably the greater we have the presence of the neighbour community, the greater contact intensity. And as we talked about just earlier, that there are different ways to quantify these answers. So most of these questions are on a Likert scale. So that's the 1 through to 5 scale of answers. So if we look at that first question of how often do focus people interact with neighbour group people, we could say, well, it happens very often, sometimes, perhaps this could be this these answers 1 to 3 we can binarize as an answer of 1, and then we have the rarely and very rarely answers as a 0. So the advantage of binarizing answers is that we can put these responses into a probability distribution of which represents a likelihood of this answer being representative of some real world observations. So I won't go into the mathematics of it, and to be honest, I'm still learning, trying to wrap my head around the concept of this. But if we binarize things, it's one way of doing statistical analysis. It's a different way of doing statistical analyses compared to the traditional inferential statistics using regression models and things like that. I think Caius might have spoken about this in his lecture. So those Likert scales, that's one way you can binarize them. The other set of answers, say the focus which language is typically spoken in this domain. So if we say that the neighbor language is spoken, or if it's a highly contextual answer where the neighbor language is perhaps spoken sometimes or in code switching, well, we say that's an instance of yes, a score of 1, meaning that neighbor presence is present. And if the answer is, well, the focus language or some other language is spoken, we say, well, the neighbor language isn't spoken much in this domain, so give it a score of 0. And so you can binarize things like this. And you may have seen something similar in Caius's talk looking at the linguistic variables, where we can produce a nominator-denominator value for each language pair to demonstrate just how intense contact is. So for this first language by Finno-Ugristik and Mandinka, so we have 11 yes neighbor presence answers to a possible of 17 questions. So we had 6 no's. So by Finno-Ugristik and Mandinka end up with a proportion of 11 to 17. If we look at the South Sami and Norwegian Swedish, second from the bottom, we can see we have 120 possible answers, of which 104 were yes to neighbor presence. So if we just compare those the the values of the first Finno-Ugristik Mandinka with South Sami, Norwegian, Swedish, you can see instinctively that the South Sami and Norwegian Swedish has more opportunities or has more observances of where contact intensity could occur. So there are not so many opportunities in the first pair. So by representing these scores in a nominator-denominator fashion, then we can put these on it's called a beta distribution to, it shows a kind of tightness of probability. So in this diagram here, I've plotted the probability distributions as box plots. The x-axis shows the value representing the intensity of contact. So the higher the value, the more intense the contact. And the tighter the box plot is, the stronger the evidence we have that the more probable it is that the score that we're showing is representative of the real world phenomena. So we can see South Sami and Norwegian Swedish, and what's this one here? The Papapana Rotokas and Bademanga Kanuri. We have quite high contact intensity scores with a good tight distribution, so we can be relatively confident that this score is showing something that's occurring in the real world. We have less certainty with the Nuklak, North Wakashan, the Ipili Hewa, and Maltese Sicilian. And the ordering of the language pairs, the way we've collected the data and the way that the data can be numericized means that we can do these kinds of statistical tests to test hypotheses that have arisen in the literature as to why language contact pans out the way it does by the sociolinguistic variables. So what I hope this quick demonstration has shown is that the comparison of context is feasible, at least, that we can do it at this gross level and you end up with low resolution, but nonetheless some kind of comparison is doable, and that the questionnaire has been answerable for a range of contact situations, and we're forever grateful to our collaborators who took the time and were extremely patient and generous in sharing their time and expertise to fill out this questionnaire. And I think, again, the data range demonstrates that the questionnaire is able to capture differences between contexts, that we're not ending up with answers where everybody's like, I don't know, it's just the midpoint, but the range is hopefully demonstrating something that is at least qualitatively different between the communities. There's plenty of things that this tool could improve on. So one of the things I feel quite strongly about is the need to reconsider some of the social domains. We've had a bit of difficulty with the social exchange domain in particular, and that's something that I would like to reconsider in future iterations. There should be more leading on of respondents to consider which social domains overlap. So, for example, the domain of labour and family and kin may overlap quite significantly in smaller communities. Local community and labour might also overlap. We could also consider, I think, revolving the data collection around completely different dimensions, or completely different as in perhaps try eliciting the explanatory factors without considering social domains. I think the explanatory factors, I think a lot of them are informative. Some of them, I'll have to look at the data again, but I think some of them are perhaps not showing us much of a range, which means that it's not a particularly informative data set. So perhaps looking at those explanatory factors from this questionnaire's point of view might also show us something interesting there too. And this is a very practical matter, but I think the future iteration of the questionnaire should consider a shorter and more accessible format. This is something that our collaborators have pointed out, that it is very long, and also it is geared towards people who have academic training, so perhaps a different type of questionnaire could be used where community members can fill it out themselves and provide a better assessment of things. And this would probably also reduce the labour involved in that it will be a kind of crowdsourcing activity. So thank you very much for your attention. This has been a very interesting and rewarding project to be part of, and I do hope that sociolinguistic typology can continue to evolve, that this is just a first step, a first attempt. Of course, there are many things that could be improved on. This is the way science works, so I do hope that this will be a springboard for further discussions and attempts into trying to enrich our understanding of the social dimensions of language contact and testing how these things affect the trajectory summary of language contact outcomes. So thank you very much for your time. And yes, if you in your discussions come up with some points that you think, what are some of the unique challenges posed by the Finno-Ugric part of the world when considering the social elements of contact? I would love to hear that kind of feedback. So perhaps, if there's a way to get, if there's a way for me to hear some of that feedback, that would be really wonderful. Thank you for your time.